Basically, tigers are a very good system to study things like how humans are impacting wildlife because we already know of tiger populations which have gone extinct. For example, in the islands of Southeast Asia or in South China, Caspian tiger have examples of extinction already happened in tigers. I wanted to work on wildlife and basically I wanted to work on understanding how humans are impacting the world around us.
Hello everyone. Today we have Dr. Uma Ramakrishnan with us, and she is a molecular ecologist and a professor at National Center for Biological Sciences, Bangalore. And this International Tigers Day, we welcome her and would like to have a session with her since she is a veteran in the field of tiger conservation as well. So we welcome you, ma'am.
Thank you. Thank you.
Ma'am, could you please brief us about your experience? Like, how did you come to this field and shift towards tiger conservation?
So I was always fascinated by wildlife, and since I was young, but I was always curious to explore more about wildlife through the lens of genetics. Just fascinated by tigers, and I ended up working on their genetics. I've been at NCBS for 20 years now, so it's a long time, and that makes me a veteran because I've had a long time to
20 years is a long time.
fumble around.
So, ma'am, you're initially, when you started as molecular ecologist only, and then you got some work, or you decided to have these wildcats as your main research area?
Yeah. So, like I said, I wanted to work on wildlife, and basically, I wanted to work on understanding how humans are impacting the world around us. It's interested in conservation. So, basically, tigers are a very good system to study things like how humans are impacting wildlife because we already know of some tiger populations which have gone extinct. For example, in the islands of Southeast Asia or in South China, Caspian tiger. So have examples of extinction already happened in tigers. So they're a really interesting system to study the processes which lead to extinction. And with that knowledge, we can think of how can we take preemptive action to prevent extinction. So the idea is that use them as a system to understand processes and then use that information to have evidence-based conservation strategies.
Yeah, that's great, ma'am. So, in today's interview, we would like to know about like your experience. We would like to know how, like, what's impacting tiger population, the breeding, and we'll be covering all those points. So, we'll be doing it under a theme: impact of climate change on tiger habitats, specifically in India, since your work is also over there. Um, so, ma'am, let's start with a thing. We are conserving tigers. There are so many. We have allotted a lot of funds to this wildcat. There are so many wildlife sanctuaries and national parks where we are saving them. But today, if we see what is a primary threat to tiger population in India.
Yeah, so basically, you're right. There's a lot of conservation attention and conservation action, bolstered through these funds and protected areas on tigers, right? Focused on tigers. And there has been recovery of tigers. There has been an increase in tiger populations, increase also in, where they are in the Indian subcontinent. They are occupying new areas also, not compared to the past, but say the recent past, like the last 10 years, right? There's been some recovery. Now, first of all, there are many places, though, where they still have not recovered, right? For example, in eastern India, areas like Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, Odisha, West Bengal, there's a lot of scope for tiger recovery in these states. While you might say that states like Maharashtra and MP, Madhya Pradesh have a lot of tigers, there's scope for recovery in other states, right? So those are some of the things which, first of all, there can be more recovery of tigers in certain other parts of the country. And the second thing is that in terms of what threats they face, I think the biggest threat is development in some sense, increased infrastructure, highways, etc., can be detrimental for connectivity for between populations, and this can lead to isolated populations, which can then again lead to other effects, which can cascade into, or like, domino effect into things like extinction. So in terms of the tiger populations itself, they are critically dependent on prey. If there are prey, there are tigers. So right now, the challenges we're facing are uh, there are tigers which are also preying on livestock, on cattle, and this results
Yeah.
in conflict sometimes with people, and that could lead to the tigers being poisoned or something like that. So we have to ensure that they are protected, the animals are protected, the habitat is protected, so that they can be recovery. So, for example, when I say there isn't much recovery, I mean, there could be more recovery in states that requires then habitat protection and prey for the tigers, and then the tigers will recover.
Ma'am, yes, you talked about habitat protection. So, how critical is habitat protection in tiger conservation efforts? Like, is it really critical?
Yeah, I mean, because if there is no habitat, then you're not going to have wild prey. You're not going to have gore or sambar deer roaming around in a city, right?
Yeah.
So they're only going to be in natural habitats. So wild prey, if we want to think of tigers as wild species which depend on wild prey, is going to be only in habitats which are at least have some level of protection. Of course, there can be areas of coexistence where people and animals co-occur, but and that those models do exist. But prey protection is also really important. There should be prey. If there are no, if there's no habitat, like if it's all like, I don't know, like some built up like a city, you are
Yeah.
not going to have prey there, right?
Yeah.
You might have rats and things like that, but you're not going to have wild prey.
Yeah, that's a good point that we do focus on the main species, that's the like wild cats, but for their survival, we need to ensure the
Yes.
prey population as well.
Yeah, they are
Yeah.
predators, right? So for
Yeah.
predators, they need the prey. And if they have prey, they are fine overall. Unless you kill, they need prey and then they need protection. That is, don't
Yeah.
kill and let them have food. And that's it. They're fine.
Yeah. Yeah. Ma'am, we are seeing due to extreme weather events, we are seeing so many environmental changes. These are mainly induced by climate change. So, what environmental changes which we are observing are most detrimental to these tiger breeding habitats in
So
some regions?
yeah, I guess the effects are more indirect. So first of all, in some places we see the tiger expanding their range because, for example, in the higher elevations in the mountains, if it as it's getting warmer,
Yeah.
like there is more like you've heard of the famous case of overlap between grizzly bears and polar bears, right? Because
Yeah.
now because it's getting warmer, grizzly bears are moving up
Um,
and then they are overlapping with the polar bears, right? So like that, now basically it's getting warm. So in some places we are seeing tigers at higher elevations than they were in the past, right? Which was more of a kind of a like a very cold environment. You are seeing it's not like they cannot survive in the cold. You have
yeah.
tigers in the Russian Far East, which is very cold, right? So they're very plastic species. So that's the first thing about climate change. Climate change most affects species which are very specialized. For example, species which live in very specific environment. Once that environment changes, they're unable to survive. But tigers are not like that. They live from the Russian Far East in, pretty much tundra, right? All
Yeah.
the way to island Southeast Asia, which is rainforest, through India. So like amazing habitats, Sundarbans, deserts, forests, everywhere they live. So they are very, very flexible species. So you would think they would be minimally impacted by climate change, right? But on the other hand, um, for example, we see a lot of, you said yourself, we're seeing a lot of like, kind of environmental catastrophes, intense weather events. And
Yeah.
these intense weather events have very negative impacts on people. So what I think is that, and that results in migration of people, changes in livelihoods,
Yeah.
very low options for livelihoods. When there's very low socioeconomic options, sometimes hunting becomes an option, right, for
Mm.
sustenance and livelihoods. So in that way, indirect effects, where people are affected, either mass movements or, without livelihoods, and this, like, agriculture fails, so there's no other livelihood except hunting, right? So these are ways in which indirectly, tiger, or maybe, poaching or, trade, right?
Yeah.
These are not maybe the first choice livelihood, but if there's no other option, right, because of climate effects, we are seeing that livelihoods are very significantly affected, especially of people who are not very empowered, not people like us who live in cities. We have ACs, we can buffer the effects in some
Yeah.
way through money, basically. But
Yeah.
others who cannot, right? They would potentially suffer, and that suffering would, could affect species like habitats of tigers, prey of tigers, as well as tigers directly. I hope that was clear.
Yeah. And ma'am, you talked about these things that how because they don't have any other option to sustain their livelihood, they move on to this thing. And in India, I think few months back there was a case also that there were people who were actually poaching tiger habitats only in the northeast, extreme northeast. And when those people they were trained and they were just they were asked why were they doing, they just said that this is their only option right now. They don't have any other option. Later on, those people were trained and were given employment in tiger conservation areas. So those people who were actually poaching later on after training got into this conservation efforts, joined the teams and organizations, and are now working for tiger conservation. So that's also a good shift. Do
Yeah,
you
yeah.
think
So I
it's
think I
also
think that, yeah. Sorry, finish. Sorry.
yeah, no, have you ever seen or heard about these things also in your experience?
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of such stories. I mean, a lot of such narratives, and I'm sure they're true. And, instance. I'm not an anthropologist or a sociologist, so I haven't studied this. But, the some recent studies suggest that, 13% of the world are indigenous people, right?
Hmm.
And a lot of these indigenous lands is where wildlife is. So they are the stakeholders of this wildlife, right? So their interests, their livelihoods, their futures are intricately tied, their well being is intricately tied to that of
Hmm.
wildlife. For example, in Africa, there are examples where during civil war, poaching goes up a lot. So
Yeah.
direct hunting of elephants and many other species goes up a lot. So I think it's really important to understand that climate can have those kind of effects.
Yeah.
Effects on humans and their livelihoods is very, very significant of climate.
Yeah. And ma'am, because of climate change, are we also seeing that genetic diversity of tigers in India is affected? It is reducing, or do we have to
No, I
face a
don't think
big
we
threat
can
on
say that. I don't think we can say that. I think we are still
that?
exploring the consequences of the, basically the hunting of tigers, which happened in the
Yeah.
last 200 years. That has probably affected genetic diversity. And we just started some work where we're trying to look at the historical tigers, the
Yeah.
trophies, hunted tigers from the last 150 years, and compare them to the modern tigers. I think direct human impacts like hunting is what has really affected them. But we still
Oh,
don't have the data to show that, right?
yeah.
Some
So we
preliminary
cannot comment.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Some preliminary results we did some time ago, almost 10 years ago. There was a very small study suggested it, but now we're really taking this on in a big way. We'll find out.
Yeah. So, ma'am, when we are talking about all these research, you are there in this field since a really good amount of time and you have studied all these areas, ma'am. Do you also feel that there are some research gaps or there are some areas we do need better understanding to focus and to learn? If first, if climate change is actually affecting tiger breeding, or in India, tiger breeding uh, is not successful at that rate which is being expected. So, Is research required, or do we have ample of data for that?
I think impacts of climate change on biodiversity in general, not just tigers, is
Hmm.
very poorly explored in India. Very poorly
Okay.
explored. There's been a lot of work because climate change is usually associated with warming. And
Yeah.
we think in India that, oh, warming is not so much of an issue. Warming seems to be more of an issue in the temperate areas, right? Like the US or Europe or something like that. But I think that there's been recently some work in on vegetation, at plants and stuff. But in terms of animals, our understanding of how climate is going to affect animals, even in the mountains where it's cold, getting warmer.
Yeah.
Like I worked for some time on pikas. They're high elevation specialists. They cannot survive in the heat at all, right? So is very poor, and we need a lot more studies to understand this. And I think that tigers are emblematic of biodiversity, but they are part of the ecosystem. So understand biodiversity response to climate is critical, and it's critical not just for biodiversity, but we know that conserving biodiversity is critical to mitigate climate impacts. So, if you have intact forests, if you have intact ecosystems, the negative effects of climate are mitigated, right?
Yeah.
On humans, like you don't have that extreme weather events, all these things. So, basically, I'm using a slightly circular argument, but I'm saying that we need to conserve biodiversity. Biodiversity is going to be impacted by climate. Need to conserve biodiversity because of itself, because of these beautiful animals, but also intact ecosystems protect us from the vagaries of climate change, right? So I think that while tigers as one species may be more affected by human impacts, building of roads, destruction of habitat, direct hunting, etc., versus climate impacts. Climate is a human created
Yeah.
condition. uh, Other species which are part of the ecosystem are all affected. And so it's important to understand the whole.
Yeah. And ma'am, again, this thing when you're saying that you use the word biodiversity, this is really significant. It's a significant issue, especially when in a country like India, whenever we are conserving species, we are creating these wildlife sanctuaries and national parks. There is a huge chunk of population has this argument that we are a country, we some regions are still poor, we don't have funds. Why are we even? They use the term wasting money in conserving these animals when people are suffering on one end. So they just don't understand this thing, this issue. What do you want to say to these people who think that wildlife should not be our focus or biodiversity because people on the first go are suffering?
So I could ask them, where is your water coming from? What about the fruits that you eat? And what about the air that you breathe? If you live in Delhi, you complain. But why? It's because the loss of, I mean, water, all like southern India, all the water comes from the Western Ghats. All the water that people drink in the Tarai comes from the Himalayas, right?
Yeah,
1/3 of the world, that is India and China, depends on glacial melt and water sources from the Himalayas, right? So the air we breathe is clean because of forests and vegetation and trees. The fruits we eat in India, particularly, are pollinated by wild insects. So
hmm.
we're getting a lot of free stuff from the environment, and we forget it's free until it collapses. And then we complain that we have to support it. So that's the problem with the environment. There's a lot of negative externalities, as environmentalists, I mean, economists say, that it's only when it collapses that you pay a price. Until it doesn't, you're enjoying its free services. So
Yeah,
I think that biodiversity is the one thing which is going to mitigate effects of climate change in India. There is no technology solutions which can help a country and a people of this size in terms of mitigating effects of climate change. Maybe some small cities and countries in Europe are setting up local solutions for this, right? With local solutions to mitigate effects of climate change. But in a place like India, with so many poor people, it is all the more important that we save biodiversity, because that biodiversity is what is going to protect us from the impacts of climate change. I'm sorry to say, not economic growth alone or politicians or any policies, the biodiversity which is going to save us.
Actually, that you actually told a very true and harsh points at the same time. That's actually what people need to know, because this is what we want right now,
Yeah, I
like the
think that's a good
basic
place
thing.
to kind of end also, hopefully.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, ma'am.
So
Because
just
see,
just
these are
to
the basic things.
yeah, also just to say one more thing, people complain a lot about India's protected areas. The total area under protection in India is 5% of landmass. The global recommended proportion is 15%.
Oh,
Okay.
so it's way
So
less than what's
we are
recommended.
much
Yeah.
below the global recommendation. And also, if you put all of India's protected areas together, only 3 times the size of Kruger National Park. So,
Oh,
we have a lot of protected areas, we have a lot of wildlife, and that is because people are very tolerant. They are very tolerant, and inherently, we have a relationship with wildlife. So, we must continue that, and we must support our biodiversity. Otherwise, we're really going to be in a bad state.
yeah. And ma'am, when you said that, like it's you gave the quick facts, the numbers at 3% to 15%, it kind of sums up everything, and like closes all the argument over there
Yeah,
about the like whatever question they raise on
yeah,
protected areas.
yeah.
That was a really yeah. Even I didn't know that
Yeah.
thing. And that
Okay.
was really helpful. Yeah. Ma'am, just last thing I just want
Yeah.
to ask you. What like we are doing so many strategies we are using, like we are protecting habitats, wildlife corridors we are making. Do you think apart from these things, for tiger conservation in India, do we need to strengthen legal framework also? Will it help in some case?
I think legal framework in India for wildlife is pretty strong. It just has to be implemented well, right?
Yeah.
I think what we need is what I would dream of is collaboration between managers, policymakers, scientists,
Yeah.
activists. So because we're all on the same side, sometimes it seems like we're at cross purposes, but we're all on the same side. So if we could work together, there could be more trust and there could be faster action. That would be really, really nice.
Okay. That was really helpful, ma'am. And I hope I'm really sure our audience will going to learn a lot of things from this. And it was really good talking to you.
Thank you so
Thank you
much.
so much for your time, ma'am. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Bye.
Bye.